Courtney Murdoch from Love Lives On, and today I am speaking with Ashley Davis Bush, a psychotherapist experienced in grief counseling and trauma recovery. She's also an accomplished author of 6 self-help books, including Transcending Loss, Understanding the Lifelong Impact of Grief, and How to Make It Meaningful. Welcome, Ashley, and thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, I'm very happy to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's our pleasure. When it comes to grieving, you've said that there are 5 musts for deep healing. What are they?
Well, in my experience, and I've been doing this work for 25 years now, the first and foremost thing that you must do is feel your feelings. And that is easier said than done because, of course, we live in a culture that doesn't particularly like to feel pain. But in fact, you really have to feel in order to heal. So feel your feelings is number one. Express your feelings is also very important. To find a way to get your feelings out, whether it's through journaling, through artwork, through painting, through planting a garden, some way of expressing the pain as well as the love. Another thing that I feel is a must is to connect with your loved one every single day. And that can be in a variety of different ways, but basically the premise under that, which is kind of your premise, is that love lives on.
Exactly.
So the relationship, even though one person has left their body and is no longer on the planet, the relationship still exists.
Right.
So finding ways to connect. Having gratitude, and in particular, when you're feeling a lot of pain, it can sort of feel like what do you mean I'm going to feel gratitude? It feels counterintuitive.
Right.
But in fact, if you start to look at the blessings in your life and in particular be grateful for the love that was there and all the ways that people support you, gratitude is really important in the healing. And then also I feel that one of the musts for healing is to re-engage with life. That even though you're still in relationship with someone who's not on the planet anymore, you're also still very much in relationship with people who are still on the planet. So you really have to make the choice to re-engage with living.
Perfect. And a common question that people ask after they've suffered a loss is, how long does grief last? How do you respond to that question?
Yeah, that's a very typical question. It's kind of complicated because I usually try to differentiate with people the difference between acute grief and subtle grief. And acute grief can last anywhere from a few weeks to a few years. And that's when the pain is especially raw, especially intense, and especially painful. But subtle grief is when there's an oscillation process where the raw parts of grief are no longer in the foreground. They're more in the background. And so you have this kind of oscillation between extreme grief and sort of background grief, and extreme grief and background grief. And in a way, that process is lifelong. Yeah. So the real answer is, how long does grief last? It lasts as long as love lasts, which is basically as long as you're alive. That you are integrating. The goal is to integrate love and loss in your life. So it's not that grieving will end, but it will shift, it will change, it will become less intense, the grief burst will spread out. There's a sense that you're going to integrate it into your life and it won't feel as raw all the time.
And in your experience, what are other common questions that your grieving patients have asked you, and what is your best advice in response to those questions?
Well, one I get a lot is, am I going crazy? And because especially in the beginning of grieving, there's a feeling that you're going crazy. You forget things, it's hard to concentrate, you lose track of things, you have what's called grief fog. Your brain gets really foggy. So a lot of people really want to know, am I going crazy? And the answer is no, you are not going crazy. This is grief. This is the nature of grief. Also, am I depressed? Do I need medication? That's a common question. And depression and grief mimic each other, but it does not mean necessarily that you need to go on medication. I tend to hold that out as a last resort because we often want to medicate away pain, and you really can't do that. That goes back to one of the initial musts. You must feel your feelings, and it's healthy to do that. So, and then I would also say another question that I hear a lot is, when will I be my old self again? And the answer to that is that you're growing into a new self.
Right.
And many people may not know what that self is going to look like, and I explain you don't need to know right now. You're living into it one day at a time, day after day. But the idea of when are you going to be your old self again, you kind of have to throw that out the window. There's not an old self that you're going to return to. There's a new self that's being born.
Right. And what are some of the different techniques or exercises that you use with your grieving patients to promote the healing process?
Well, a lot of what I do is normalize their experience. So in the same way of, are you going crazy? No, you're not. This is grief. I do a lot of kind of psychoeducation, explaining to people what is in the realm of normal, what grief looks like over time. So I do a lot of basically normalizing. I also have people bring their photos in to share their stories, to part of grieving is a kind of replay, that you need to tell the story over and over, not only of how the person died, whether it was traumatic and sudden, or whether it was expected and sort of a process that you saw coming. So you need to tell the story of the exit, but you also need to tell the story of the love, of the kinds of things you loved about that person, and things that you shared and memories that you share. So I really encourage telling of the stories and bringing in photos. But another exercise that I really love to work with people around is called automatic writing. And automatic writing means that you write to your deceased loved one. And I generally recommend doing that by using your dominant hand. So if you're right-handed, you write a letter to them in your right hand. And then you write a letter from your deceased loved one back to you using your non-dominant hand. So in this case, your left hand. In other words, it becomes a way to kind of communicate with your loved one. And some people will think it sounds crazy. How are they going to write me back? And it is kind of out of the box, if you will. But I've seen hundreds of people do this exercise, and even the ones who are particularly skeptical feel something come through. Something comes through them that they can't quite explain, and they are able to sort of correspond with their loved one.
That's awesome.
It is really neat when it when it happens.
A lot of our viewers have also expressed feelings of frustration when well-meaning friends and family members say things like, "Time heals all wounds," or "I know what you're going through." So what kinds of things should we say and should we avoid saying when we're trying to offer support to someone who's grieving?
Right. Yeah, a lot of things are said, and I try to remind people that especially people who are grieving, who get frustrated and upset with these things that people say, is to remember that they're not trying to hurt you. They're not trying to be malicious. I mean, in general, maybe some occasionally are, but in general, they just don't know what else to say. So they often will come up with platitudes, or they'll say things like, God needed another angel in heaven. God won't give you more than you can bear. And, try to basically soothe in some way. But of course, mostly those things are not soothing. So what to say instead? In general, less is more. Just say, I don't know what to say. I'm here for you. Basically, hugs. A lot of times words aren't what's helpful. So give someone a hug, or just touch their arm and say, I am so, so sorry for your loss. Try not to offer explanations. And also be willing to listen. There's an expression that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so we should be listening twice as much as speaking. So you can ask someone, tell me about your experience with grief. Tell me about your loved one. Tell me what you miss. Invite them to talk. If they want to, they will. If they don't want to, they won't, and that's fine. So you have to either be willing to listen or willing to not listen. And the other thing I usually suggest to people is show up with a plant or cookies or a candle or some kind of thoughtful gift or a book. Don't just say, call me if you need me. Most people, that's a very frequent thing. I'm here for you. Call me if you need me. Let me know what I can do. that puts pressure on the grieving person to both take initiative or to ask for something. It's much better just to either show up and say, I'm here to do some chores or errands for you. Tell me what to do.
Yeah.
I'm here. Or, as I said, show up with a gift and just say, I'm here. Or be the one who calls. Call and check in once a month, 6 months later. Most grievers get a ton of attention around the funeral, and then a month, 2 months, 3 months go by, and no one's around anymore. No one's inquiring, how are you doing?
Yeah.
So be the one that shows up months and months later.
Excellent advice.
Mm-hmm.
And you're known for your belief that all life is miraculous and that all life's experiences have the opportunity to help us live a more meaningful life. Can you explain how you think that grief and loss gives us that opportunity to grow?
Yes. Well, it was Albert Einstein who said we can live as if everything's a miracle or as if nothing's a miracle. And you're right, I do believe that everything ultimately is a miracle. But then when something tragic happens, or just a loss that takes our breath away, that tears our heart in two, we can lose track of that. We can start to feel that life doesn't have meaning, that the miracle isn't an everyday experience. We can lose heart. So I want to emphasize that grieving is really hard work. I mean, it can be shattering when your life seems to just fall apart. And yet, the heart is resilient, and the human spirit is resilient. And we really have so many years of human history of people moving forward after a loss, not so much moving on. That's another one of those expressions.
Yes.
When are you going to move on?
Right.
And it's not so much that you're going to move on, you're going to move forward with life, but with your loved one's presence and love still with you. So when I'm certainly not the only one to believe this, but that grief and loss can lead to what we call post-traumatic growth, which is kind of a buzzword in the psychological field these days, which is this idea that you can use a tragedy or a heartbreak or a trauma or a difficult time to actually be a springboard for new growth. But it does require some intention. It does require some willingness for that to be possible. And usually it takes time for that to happen, because you really have to do the grief work first, the hard part of what I talked about earlier, the feelings, expressing the feelings, being open to learning what is this teaching me? Basically it's an invitation of questions for yourself. What can I learn from this? The question that shifts from why did this happen, why me, to what now? What can I do with this? How can I make this benefit people? How can I turn this to good? And so you see many people who take their loss and start nonprofit organizations. They have fundraisers. Mothers Against Drunk Driving, MAD, was started by a bereaved mother. Not that everyone has to start a national organization, but in my book, Transcending Loss, I gave an acronym to this idea of growth, which was SOAR, S-O-A-R. And the S stands for spirituality. The O stands for outreach, the A stands for attitude, and the R stands for reinvestment. And it's the idea that a griever has the potential to change in all of these ways, to change and have your spirituality get deeper and stronger, to change and start reaching out to other people, especially other people who suffer, to have an attitude change about what life and death really mean and what matters, and then to change in terms of how you reinvest in this world and how you put your time into things that have meaning. But again, it's a complicated sort of one day at a time process, but ultimately I think it has to do with intention of saying, I'm open to the lessons that life is bringing me. The Buddhists say that grief is the greatest teacher, but you have to be willing to learn from the teacher. Yes. And when you're in a state of severe sorrow, you can't always get in the place where you can learn it. So you have to let yourself start to heal so that you can open. There's a book about grief called Permission to Mourn, and the gentleman who wrote it had quite a number of losses. And he said he started to make a shift when he started to change from, this didn't happen to me, it happened for me. So the idea that these losses or this whatever it was that you're struggling with, it didn't happen to you. It happened for you, for your growth, for your invitation to take it and do something with it.
And what's your advice if someone is just very stuck after suffering a loss? How do they get unstuck and open themselves up to that opportunity to grow, as you said?
Right, right. I think that it's easy to get stuck and to feel like you're in a dark place and there's no light. So there's no simple answer. It's kind of complicated. For some people, getting unstuck means they have to touch their pain. They have to let their pain come in because they've actually kept it at arm's length. For other people, they've gotten stuck because they have touched their pain. They've touched it so much they've gotten stuck in it and can't get out of it.
Right.
And if that's the case, I usually recommend talking with a counselor, talking with a friend, joining a grief group so they can try to hear what other people are doing. Certainly there's lots of online support groups to try to talk to other people. That getting unstuck is not just going to happen naturally, so you have to put some effort into it. It may be reading some books about grief. It may be doing some volunteer work, saying, I've just got to get out of myself. I'm going to go do something to help someone else. I think different people find ways to jumpstart the energy, but basically it requires intention and attention, that you have to start making an effort. It's not going to happen on its own. But it can happen, and once you get the momentum, it becomes easier.
Yeah. And lastly, just tell us a little bit about your book, Transcending Loss, and what's the main message that you would like people who are grieving to take from the book?
Yeah, well, I wrote Transcending Loss 20 years ago. I can't believe it's been that long.
Wow, yeah.
It's like amazing. And I also have another grief book that came out in the past year called Hope and Healing for Transcending Loss, which is a daily reader. It's daily meditations to read every day, and those daily readings encapsulate the message of Transcending Loss, which is basically, like we talked about before, that love lasts forever, that the relationship continues, and that there's no closure per se. A lot of people want to find closure, but that's sort of a double-edged sword. If you closed the pain or the sense of loss, you might also close the love. And as we know, love is eternal, love is transcendent. And the idea of transcendence, I like that word because it implies that you have a broader perspective, a bigger sense of possibility. It's like if you're on the top of a high building, you have a different perspective on the world than when you're on the ground. And transcendence is about, over time, being able to gain this perspective so that you can see grief as a piece of, it's a puzzle piece in your life, but it's not the total puzzle. And so taking that puzzle piece and giving it a bigger context, a bigger frame, so that you can have a bigger perspective on life, but you're taking the love with you, and that's really the key, is that the love lasts forever.
Amazing.
I
want to thank you so much again for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed it as well.
Thanks. This is Courtney from Love Lives On. Thank you for watching. If you like what you see, please subscribe to our YouTube channel for more ways we can celebrate our loved ones' lives now and forever.